Thank you very, very much, Dr. Irvin. I couldn't imagine what he was going to do when he spoke of 1956 and this particular write-up. I remember being in Guysborough, in Sunnyvale, in Tracadie, and I do remember the occasion, and I need to look at the picture to see whether that's right. I don't know of a better place in which to be a guest than here at Acadia. I have just been treated royally and have been enjoying every moment of it, and want to thank everyone very, very much for your very, very gracious and generous hospitality. I want to speak tonight on the subject of community, the goal of the moral life, under our general topic. Now, first of all, let me say that in accordance with John S. Mbiti, to whom I'm much indebted for much of the background for these lectures, he gives a five-fold structure of African cosmological thought. And the five-fold structure is this: God as the ultimate explanation of the origin and sustenance of human beings and things. God is at the top of this pyramid. Spirits, secondly, being made up of superhuman beings and the spirits of men who died a long time ago. That's the second. And the second is what I refer to primarily as divinities. And I said today that usually these lesser divinities, that they have never been human beings. Well, I want to take that back and say occasionally they have been, but hundreds of years before. Three, there's human beings who are alive and those who are yet to be born, because the yet to be born are realities. Four, animals and plants, and the remainder of biological life, if there is more. And five, objects without biological life. So that five-fold structure comprises, in the spiritual realm, or from the perspective of the spiritual realm, a unity, a harmony, and that harmony becomes a model for the harmony that ought to exist in humans, between humans, and between history and nature, and so forth. So that Mbiti's analysis claims that the various realms of reality, those five, within the African cosmological order are ranked hierarchically and they function harmoniously. That is to say, the spiritual realm is integrally related to the historical and the natural realms. For example, the integral relation of the spirits with human beings is seen in the African conception of death, which I mentioned last evening. Herein lies a crucial difference between African and Western understandings. In the worldview of the African, there is no death in the sense of radical separation from family and the tribal community. Rather, it is believed that a good death, that is, the death of a person who has reached old age and who has many children who are doing well, marks the transition of the human spirit to a state of immortality, and that is a good death. And on those occasions, you don't really mourn in a sad way, but it is a time of rejoicing and celebration and many, many rituals in the process. Henceforth, the deceased person is thought to live on in the spirit world in a state of existence that Mbiti appropriately names the living dead. In this state, the deceased continues to have consciousness of the family, and the family is expected to perform prescribed rituals in order to maintain the good favor of the recently departed one. The deceased continues in this state for as long as there are persons alive who knew him or her in the flesh. That is, the immortality is dependent upon the remembrance of the person by name by those who are living. When memory of the deceased ends among the living, and no one can remember him or her by name, the deceased may be said to have fully died. Henceforth, the spirit of what was once characterized as the living dead now becomes what I call objectified spirit, which Africans refer to as an it. These objectified spirits can pose great danger to humans because their activities are no longer guided by human devotion. Hence, with no one to claim their protection, their raison d'etre is nullified, and the loss of communal relationship causes these objectified spirits to act capriciously. The living dead are spiritual protectors of the family, and they function as intermediaries between God and the divinities on the one hand, and the living family on the other. And that is, they function much like the way that saints function in the Roman Catholic tradition. The relationship between the two, that is, between the ancestors, or the living dead, and the family, is both reciprocal and complementary. That is to say, each is dependent on the other. The living dead needs the family to keep alive their memory and ensure their immortality. Hence the importance of marriage and procreation, which have long been considered necessary for every African from ancient times up to the present day. Without progeny, persons can have no immortality in the spirit world, because there would be no one to preserve their memory and thereby sustain a communal relationship with them when they should have departed historical life. In short, apart from progeny, humans are not able to enter the realm of the living dead at all, and thus the latter's existence depends on the family. Further, since Africans believe not only in the immortality of souls, but also in their rebirth, the living dead are dependent on the family for their reincarnation in subsequent generations. Yet the relationship between the living dead and the family is reciprocal. The family also needs the living dead to intercede on its behalf with the higher divinities. And this function is well described by many different scholars. Apart from their relationship with the living dead, families would be deprived of any direct access to the spiritual realm, since neither the objectified spirits nor the divinities have any personal relationship with them. The relationship is communal, not personal. But the ancestors, the spirits who die and live in the spirit realm, these have the direct access to the family, and hence the link. There's no gap between the family and the spirit realm. The mutual exchange of responsibilities and duties between the living dead and their families is reflective of the moral ethos in general. Harmony is the paramount goal in all the possible relationships within this fivefold cosmological order, and herein lies its ethical significance, since that harmony is the goal and the justification of all moral obligations. In the African context, each tribal community, and by tribe I mean nothing more than a language-speaking group, and it's unfortunate, as I said this afternoon, that the term tribe has come to take on pejorative meanings for so much of the Western world, because only African peoples and Native Canadians and Native Americans have been thought of as being composed of tribal groups. But a tribe is the same as we would know the French, and the distinction between the French and the Germans and the English and the Poles and so forth. I mean, that distinction, however you want to talk about it, is the same type of distinction that is measured by the term tribe in Africa. Each tribal community or language-speaking group has its own myths of origin, depicting God's creation of their respective group. Accordingly, their societal systems are similarly derived. For example, in monarchical societies, the king ruled in accordance with the will of God, not unlike the divine right of kings, excepting that in the African context, the issue of succession is not strictly hereditary. It is partially hereditary, but in many other ways quite democratic, and much more democratic than it would be if it were strictly hereditary. That is to say, the king was God's priest, and as such represented the authoritative, moral, political, and religious center of the tribal community. African kings are official guardians of the ancestral charters. When legitimated by the people, they stand at the ritual apex of their people's social and moral order. African kings could never appear to be like ordinary men, even though they were never perceived as gods. They were supposed to live their lives in private, never to be seen doing the mundane things of life, except by their most privileged servants. Each had his sacred symbols of office, and often lived in palaces, and one of his chief duties was to perform certain rituals regularly, so as to bind the ancestors closely to the people and to maintain harmony between the society and its environment. In the African perspective, the moral and religious character of the king was directly correlated with the people's good. Let me give you a quotation here. Ideally, the king should be strong and handsome, generous of mind, bold in warfare, cunning in counsel, and devout in everyday life. He should epitomize a people at one with its moral order, at peace with itself, at every point in harmony with the ancestors who brought us into our land and gave us life. In traditional African society, the fundamental moral goal that superseded all others was the conservation of harmony between the tribal group, its natural environment, and the spiritual realm. This moral goal was expressed in everything that was undertaken, either individually or collectively. Any action intended to harm others constituted a threat to the moral harmony of the whole group, and hence it had to be purged by appropriate counteraction. Otherwise, the negative effects might know no end. Thus, the moral life of Africans involved the constant discharge of moral obligations in ritual and social practice, the rendering of service, and the giving of material assistance to others. In short, attending to the good of the community was and is the highest moral value practiced by the gods, the ancestors, the ruling authorities, and all the people. You see, so that the good of the community, its maintenance and preservation and enhancement, is the goal of all of the gods, the ancestors, the rulers, and the people at large. Serving one's own selfish interests characterize the nature of moral evil. Selfishness, by definition, was and is wrong in the African context because it places the individual's personal interests over and against the community's good, and thereby upsets the cosmological order. How then are we to reconcile the moral importance of community, sketched out just now, with the issue of African slavery, which depicts more graphically than anything else the seeming moral insensitivity of African slaveholders and slave traders? In fact, African complicity with both the Atlantic and the Asiatic slave trade was widespread in that so-called African middlemen controlled the supply end of the system from the 16th to the 20th century. European slave traders controlled the demand. They set the demand. But they did not have direct access to the source for the slaves. And that is a long, complicated story in itself, which has been told by many people in many different ways. But it is beyond the scope of this lecture to describe the massive suffering and the immense evil of slavery, or to demonstrate its pathological effects on the infrastructure of African societies. Suffice it to say, however, that the entire continent continues to live in the aftermath of its devastating effect. In the early centuries of the practice of slavery, neither Christians nor Africans saw any moral problem attending the activities of slave holding or slave trading. In the case of Africans, this was due principally to the fact that African cosmological thought was essentially tribal and ethnocentric, and consequently contained no universal conception of humanity. Thus, the moral codes by which African slave traders lived contained no principled warrants against the treatment of some human beings as economic commodities, so long as the captives were not wantonly taken from within one's own tribal community. I mean, that wasn't done. But people who would be guilty of great crimes of various sorts might be sentenced to slavery. That was a different thing within one's tribal group. But to plunder other peoples was normally the way the slaves were got. And that was done, as I said, by Africans. And so African slaves did not arrive on these shores as full-blown abolitionists. Rather, their eventual arrival at that position evidenced their emergence as a new people, imbued with a new worldview which they had developed in their new environment. And underlying this transformation was their discovery of an authentic Christian gospel that stood in opposition to slave-holding Christianity. Interestingly, with respect to the issue of slavery, there was virtually no difference between slave-holding Christianity and traditional African religions. Slave traders saw no contradiction between being Christian and being a transporter of human cargo. This apparent innocence evidences itself when one discovers that many slave ships and slave warehouses were named after Jesus Christ. I visited Fort Jesus on the coast of Kenya in Mombasa some years ago. It was built in the 15th century. No moral dilemma was seen in any of this. Interestingly, some of our most beloved Christian hymns were composed by captains of slave ships during meditative moments on the high seas. It was only after Christians had recognized the full humanity of African peoples that the seeds of abolitionism began to appear. It is curious, however, that Christianity seems not to have espoused abolitionist thought during earlier periods of the Christian era. Nevertheless, the major differences between Christian and traditional African thought lies in this issue. But unlike Christianity, unlike traditional African thought, however, black and white abolitionists were able, eventually, to find resources within the biblical tradition to oppose that which their forebears had supported, namely slavery. Now, captive peoples, far removed from their homeland, inevitably long for the security of family and community. African slaves in the diaspora were no exception. Nostalgia for a common experience, nostalgia was a common experience for them as long as they had specific memories of their former life in Africa. But loss of such memory destroyed the retrospective longing. Systematically stripped of their native languages, beliefs, and customs, the slaves gradually lost the sense of tribal belonging in terms of specific geographical and cultural location in Africa. The implications of that loss were immense because it was tantamount to the loss of primary identity. Such deprivation constituted one of the most devastating effects of the African slave experience. As the tribal memory of the American slaves, North American slaves, grew dimmer and dimmer with each succeeding generation, their sense of tribal belonging, that is, specific personal and communal identity, gradually perished in spite of the continuing influence of what might be called the African ethos, which exhibited itself in music, song, folklore, styles of leadership, religious practice, and belief. Yet such cultural continuities were tribally non-specific. Thus, Africans in the diaspora were pressed to construct a new identity. The complexity of that task varied from place to place. In Brazil, Caribbean, elsewhere in Latin America, the circumstances of migration and the concentration of more homogenized populations enabled greater continuity of specific tribal cultures than was possible in North America. North American slaveholders gave deliberate attention to the diversification of African slave populations, and severe proscriptions were enforced against African cultural practices. Clearly, the loss of specific tribal identity constituted a fundamental break between Africans in the diaspora and those in the homeland. As a substitute for the loss of tribal identity, the people in the diaspora gradually developed a more generalized identity based on the continental locus of their descent. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned yesterday, the term Africa is a European construct used to designate a continental landmass inhabited by a particular race of people with whom Europeans had engaged in a massive trade of goods and humans for many centuries. Although many Africans in the diaspora eventually assumed most of the contemporary pejorative attitudes towards Africa as being uncivilized, idolatrous, savage-like, cannibalistic, they nevertheless reinterpreted the term Africa for themselves and gave it transcendent meaning by elevating it to the symbolic order of discourse. Now, the result may well constitute one of the most creative achievements during slavery. I'm saying that Africa, the term, began to function as a symbol, and in much the same way as a religious symbol functions. This symbolization of Africa by the African diaspora enabled them to take possession of their own reality, and in doing so, they succeeded in thwarting what Charles Long calls their oppressors' linguistic conquest. You see, if your oppressor uses language that defines you, and you take on the use of the same language, you are in danger of oppressing yourself. And some of that did happen. But if you reinterpret the term for yourself, then you are doing battle. You're doing a linguistic battle with those who would oppress you. Now, there can be no literal definitions of symbols because symbols transcend their literal forms. That is to say, symbols point to realms of meaning beyond themselves. Accordingly, the symbol Africa came to include the more than 2,000 tribal communities on the continent, and to transcend that complexity by implying a genuine unity. As a peculiar construct of the African diaspora, the term virtually became a sacred symbol for all succeeding generations of Africans in the diaspora. As Charles Long says, the image of Africa as image related to historical beginnings has been one of the primordial religious images of great significance. It constitutes the religious revalorization of the land, a place where the natural and ordinary gestures of the blacks were and could be authenticated. In this connection, one can trace almost every nationalistic movement among the blacks and find Africa to be the dominating and guiding image. Even among religious groups, not strongly nationalistic, the image of Africa or Ethiopia still has reverence. This is present in such diverse figures as Richard Allen, who organized the African Methodist Episcopal Church in the late 18th century, through Martin Delaney in the late 19th century, and then again in Marcus Garvey's Back to Africa movement of the immediate post-World War I period. And finally, in the taking up of this issue again among black leaders in the 1960s and the 1970s. End of quote. I just thought I'd read that rather long quote, and he goes on at great length to talk about this symbol functioning religiously for so many people. Thus, the basic struggle against the dehumanization process of slavery took place in the consciousness of the African slaves. In the midst of their suffering, they forged structures of religious meaning, structures of social identity, of cultural expression, and of moral value. Their creative consciousness was typified in their loyalty and devotion to Africa as a transcendent symbol. This achievement marked a veritable watershed in their moral struggle against racial oppression, a struggle fueled by the human impulse to preserve and enhance its own humanity. The symbol Africa represented the continuity of a people with their past, the specific content of which was rapidly disappearing from their consciousness. Yet the symbol implied community, the paramount moral and religious value among African peoples. Thus, as prefix, the symbol implied transformative and foundational meaning, like African Methodist, like African Baptist. The symbol itself, African, designates transformative and foundational meaning, because others viewed that symbol negatively, and these people viewed it positively. To construct their own identity in this conscious way is and has been a creative art. But it is deeply rooted in the importance of community in the African context. Because without community, one dies, literally. And there are lots of stories told and lots of studies have been done by psychologists on the estrangement that African students have found living abroad. Because when they're cut off from their communities, the loneliness and the anomie and so forth is immense. So if you can imagine what it would have been like for slaves taken as children and as young people and so forth, at whatever age, to a foreign land and to be treated the way that they were and cut off. The cutting off was such a devastating experience that words can hardly explain it. Clearly, slaveholders identified, I'm sorry, I don't want to read that. I want to, but it'll take too much time. The Pulitzer Prize winner, Toni Morrison, if you haven't read anything by Toni Morrison, then you must. Toni Morrison wrote the book Beloved and got a Pulitzer Prize for that. She wrote several other novels. She's a wonderful novelist. And much of her thinking and writing has to do with an artistic and a literary treatment of the experience of slavery. And it's filled with symbolism. She has described slavery as an unspeakable horror. This was her way of explaining why the first generation of ex-slaves wanted to forget their past altogether. In fact, everyone, including the former slaveholders, felt the same way. I mean, everybody wanted to experience amnesia at the end of slavery. Since the ex-slaves could see at first no redemptive reason for remembering such an evil error, there were at least two good reasons for a deliberate lack of remembrance. One, the memory itself was so painful that it tended to immobilize rather than energize the people in their search for a new life outside the house of bondage. Two, in light of a general lack of public sympathy for the condition of the ex-slaves and little sense of guilt on the part of former slaveholders, public activities of remembrance might inadvertently enable the white population to retain their memory of slavery, and more importantly, the attitudes of depravity and inferiority that they had long associated with every form of slave culture. Now, while both of these reasons pertained in different ways to the internal psychological needs of the ex-slaves, the second also reflects the slaves' viewpoint that they should do everything in their power to help their former slaveholders overcome their racial prejudices and to do nothing that might in any way be construed as contributing to the reverse. Accordingly, they felt that anything that would remind whites of the conditions of slavery would not be a constructive means to their desired end, which was first-class citizenship. Thus, the ex-slaves did not seek at first to institutionalize their memory of the evil, but instead to focus their attention on the various celebrative events commemorating their emancipation. African peoples have always tended to be disinterested in remembering sorrow and pain unless it pointed to some good beyond itself. And the only good relative to slavery was its end. And so you celebrate the end, but not the remembrance. Hence, in the aftermath of emancipation, most churches no longer thought it spiritually desirable or prudently wise to sing the spirituals for two reasons. That's in the early period. One, the sorrow and suffering that they reflected seemed to be counterproductive to the demands of the present situation, and their message of hope was thought to have been actualized. That is, the hope for freedom, they thought that they had it. And secondly, in light of their newly acquired freedom, the spirituals no longer reflected their social condition and consequently had become inadequate means, or were thought to be inadequate means, for spiritual expression and divine grace. Since the style of African worship on the continent and in the diaspora had always been that of approaching the divine through the medium of existential needs and concerns expressed in cultural forms, the ex-slaves now found themselves in a situation that called for forms of worship that reflected their new social condition. Throughout the Reconstruction period, the ex-slaves were primarily concerned with the issue of racial uplift out of the abyss of social degradation caused by centuries of slavery. Remembering the degradation seemed a most unlikely method for achieving the desired uplift. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm of the ex-slaves in America for constructing a new life in freedom was crushed by the fall of the Reconstruction period, an event that many viewed as a new descent into slavery. And in light of that betrayal, the symbols and rhythms of many of the former slave songs once again seemed relevant for collective worship and personal devotion. You might have heard of the Fisk University Jubilee Singers that really popularized the spirituals during the 1880s, late 1880s and the 1890s by traveling all over North America and over much of Western Europe, and sang even before the royal houses of Europe these songs. They felt that the situation then was ripe for these songs to once again be used in worship because they were appropriate to their political and social situation, where only less than 2 decades following the Emancipation Act, there went into operation the legalization of racial segregation and discrimination, which led to blacks having no rights whatsoever as citizens in that were practiced or acknowledged. This was a sad commentary on the socio-political situation that the ex-slaves were destined to experience for the first half of the 20th century. With the passing of time, however, Africans in the diaspora saw the importance of historical memory and began the process of institutionalizing academic research and writing relative to their history and making it publicly available not only to future generations of blacks, but to whites as well. But the primary aim was never that of highlighting the evil of slavery as an end in itself, but only as a means for demonstrating how the Africans survived and progressed in spite of centuries of oppression. This venture caused blacks to depart to some extent from their customary style of keeping the internal life of their community concealed from whites, which has been, and in some cases continues to be, a necessary survival mechanism in a hostile environment. But once you take scholarship seriously, then it is available for the world. But yet, on the other hand, much of the internal life of the spirit of black North Americans is and continues to be concealed from whites because of the hostility that is felt in the environment in which they live. In their reflections on the moral insensitivity and cruelty of white slaveholders, African slaves were inclined to attribute the cause of such evil to an original fault in the nature of white people. In fact, that presumption is rather commonplace in much of African American folklore. On the one hand, this moral judgment seems self-evident to slaves, given the ubiquitous misery they continuously endured at the hands of whites. But on the other hand, it implied a contrary view of the moral nature of African people. That is, if you say that whites are morally depraved by nature, it implies that blacks are otherwise. But that's a view that had little or no foundation in the everyday experiences of the slaves themselves. They knew that they were not good. Nevertheless, this presumption did become commonplace among African slaves everywhere and formed the ideational context in which they eventually shaped their basic moral understandings. In short, theirs eventually became a racial ethic, initially based on the presupposition that in their relationship towards blacks, whites were morally depraved. Yet it is interesting to note that this ethic did not assume that slaves were by nature morally pure. In fact, slaves made no such moral claims about their own moral virtue. Rather, their moral reflections centered on the paramount experience of their everyday life, which led them to distrust the so-called moral teachings and practices of their white owners and overseers. And consequently, for a long while, ambiguities of various kinds permeated their own moral understandings. In fact, the ubiquity of their oppression convinced them that the sources and norms of moral goodness lay in a transcendent place beyond the control of slaveholders. And in this sense, African peoples in the diaspora, like African peoples in the continent, have always been religious because they see the deep source of moral value lying in a transcendent reality beyond the human condition, but concerned with and involved with the human condition. The presumption that slaveholders were immoral by nature was always counterproductive because unwittingly it removed them from the moral universe, thereby making them no more responsible for their actions than the lower animals. Similarly, although the view that African peoples were morally superior to whites might have had some validity as a generalization in the specific context of slavery, it could not have been justified by any empirical appeal to the moral nature of Africans themselves. And thus it appears that this aspect of the racial ethic of the slaves served a heuristic function only. Nevertheless, the Africans' commitment to community as a paramount moral value dominates in this racial ethic. In spite of its judgment of white moral depravity, Africans in the diaspora never gave up on the goal of constituting some type of viable community life with their former slaveholders. But constituting a community among themselves was a necessary priority because there was no other way to protect and preserve their fundamental values of self-respect and dignity, which were constantly trampled upon by the hostility of the white world. And so, free persons in the United States and Canada and elsewhere found it necessary to build their own racially separate organizations and institutions in order to avoid complicity with the moral evil of racism, which constantly threatened the moral integrity of everybody, whites and blacks included. Yet in those separate spaces, the preeminent norm was the universal ideal of a racially integrated community of harmony, peace, and unity. Blacks have always been uneasy with the necessity of having to form racial institutions. And they justified that on the basis of if they didn't do that, they then would be involved in complicity with the racism in those other contexts. They gave those other contexts a try. They sat for long periods of time in the segregated sections of the white churches, and they went to the communion rail for a long while after everyone else who was white had gone before them. and they left the church after all whites had left, and so forth. They endured all of that, but then they felt that they were helping the system of injustice rather than trying to counteract it. And so in the racially separate institutions that blacks have formed, they have never practiced racism within those boundaries. And whites have always been welcomed, and everyone who knows of any whites who have ever gone to these places know the hospitality with which they are greeted. Because the norm that governs those places is the norm of pressing for the goal of a wider community of integration and harmony and peace and unity. This ideal is institutionalized in our churches and embodied in our major leaders from the days of slavery up to the present day. Even though nationalistic philosophies advocating permanent structures of racial separation have appeared in every generation, they have failed to become predominant among Africans in the diaspora. I contend that this profound commitment to such expanded community is one of the lasting legacies Africans in the diaspora have bequeathed to the world. As an amalgam of pragmatic Christian and African elements, this legacy has expanded and deepened the limited understandings of human community as held by traditional African and Western cultures. That's not a very good sentence, but I hope you get the point. Further, we need to say that their belief in the immoral nature of slaveholders was a viewpoint that the Africans did not have prior to their transatlantic enslavement. In the African context, a fall into slavery implied either wrongdoing on the part of the slave himself or herself, or by someone else in his or her community. That is to say, slavery was viewed as punishment by the gods and or ancestors for human wrongdoing. And this implied the need for cleansing, and hence the rise of an enormous number of spiritual rites and practices among the slaves. Further, Africans had long practiced domestic slavery, wherein the slave became attached to the family and gradually assimilated into the family, beginning at the lowest ranks in the family. Obviously, African treatment of domestic slaves was quite different from that of Europeans and Americans. And thus, unlike slaves in the diaspora, those in Africa do not appear to have developed a similar style of resistance, mainly because they were incorporated gradually into the family structure, and by the second generation were functioning pretty much as full family members. Unfortunately, little is known about the moral thinking of Africans engaged in the foreign export of slaves, or the treatment of those in Africa while awaiting transport on the foreign ships. It is reasonable, however, to assume that their African captors imagined that the conditions of slavery in foreign lands would be similar to that in their own, even though, for reasons already discussed, we have no reason to believe that they felt any empathy towards or moral constraints against either the holding or the trading of slaves. In short, they did not feel morally connected to anyone whose destiny was the condition of slavery. And that's the underlying the term destiny there, because that was another reason why many slaves felt that they were slaves, because they were predestined to be slaves. And therefore it's very difficult to do anything about that, and hence the many rituals and so forth to try to cleanse and to nullify and to alter the destiny. I am rapidly coming to a close. Thus, African community among the diaspora replaces, I'm sorry, I'm lost here. Okay, replaces the tribal community on the continent, and Christian theological substance is substituted for the specific content of traditional African religions. That is, African community among slaves replace tribal community on the continent, and Christian theological substance is substituted for the specific content of traditional African religions. Now, a loss of language facilitated this transference. If one goes to Brazil, one can find African peoples living there who have not lost the language, and therefore they've maintained the content of the cosmological thinking and so forth. But with the loss of language, there is inevitably and necessarily a loss of the content. In all such contexts, wholeness, harmony, unity, togetherness, community are synonyms for the most fundamental moral values of African peoples. Enjoying one another, having a good time, celebrating and affirming life, robust and zealous living are the fruits of the good life. I could not help but be impressed this morning when Rick Tobias asked the question, amongst a number of other questions, and said, how do we proclaim the good news to people who already know how to party better than we do? And that is so appropriate for African peoples, because a love for life and the joy of life and the celebration of life is abundant wherever one is, and that is facilitated by music and song, whether one can sing or dance or not. As foundation and goal of the moral life, community pervades the social reality of African peoples, and either implicitly or explicitly constitutes the substance of their cultural products in aesthetics, music, and song. Further, and most importantly, this moral substratum is commensurate with such moral virtues as prudence, moderation, love, and justice, to mention only a few. And further still, the chief function of the community's formal structures is to nurture and promote the moral virtues in all of its members. And thus, individual persons and the community as a whole share a common moral goal. Just about one more minute. A word must be said about leadership. And as I've said earlier, the traditional African king was the chief intermediary between the people and the spiritual world. Hence, he functioned as both sacred priest and sovereign ruler. Other full-time professional priests attended to the altars of specific divinities. In the diaspora, the clergy function as kingly priests, exercising enormous authority and influence, although their powers are considerably more limited in scope than those of African kings. Traditionally, they have been acknowledged as the titular heads of their local communities, where they enjoy the devoted respect and faithful loyalty of their people. Since the churches have been the primary institutions owned and controlled by the black communities, and since their primacy has rarely been challenged, their leaders represent the gateway to the community. And although the churches tend to have various control mechanisms in place to guard against despotism, as they have in Africa, they are not always effective, unfortunately. Longevity of office may nullify the effectiveness of those mechanisms. Also, like all hierarchies, these may become vulnerable to corruption. In serving the interest, which in the black community, corruption is fundamentally, you're really corrupt if you serve the interests of the white power structure first and foremost at the expense of the black community. Because nothing could militate more against community and its foundations than serving the interests of the structure that is opposed to your well-being and flourishing. I'm sure that, I hope I haven't, if this last section upsets somebody, then let me know quickly, please, so I can correct it. or correct what I'm trying to say. I hope that it's not misunderstood. But I'm saying that the black clergy have really integrated the roles of king and priest in the diaspora, and it functions similarly, though not exactly. But I know that some people might not like that. So, okay, thank you very, very much.